There's just so much.
You're listening to a Mamamia podcast.
Mamamia acknowledges the traditional owners of land and waters that this podcast is recorded on. Hello and welcome to Mamamia Out Loud. It's what women are actually talking about on Monday, the 2nd of September. I'm Holly Wainwright.
I'm Mia Freedman.
And I'm Jessie Stevens.
And on the show today, Angelina Jolie has no friends. Is that a problem? We discuss.
Mia delivers a monologue.
Also,
There's always been a red flag there for me.
why everywhere you look, there's a row going on about how much the government should know about your sexuality. We're explaining the census fuss. And a very famous sexy calendar says that it is back post Me Too, sexier than ever, and what is going on with that. But first, Jessie Stevens.
In case you missed it, a Paralympian named Ahmed Kelly has been on an emotional roller coaster after being disqualified in the heat of his 150-metre medley and then going on to win a silver medal in the same event. That is a little riddle.
What?
How do you get disqualified and then win a medal?
Ahmed is one of our Paralympians, right? Australian Paralympian.
He's Australian.
Doing
We
well in the pool.
love Ahmed.
Yep.
Kelly swam in the heat of the medley event, and when he looked up at the board, he saw the three letters that no swimmer wants to see.
DSQ.
DSQ.
Look at you.
Honestly, you're a
with-
commentator.
You with your
Oh,
sports
you're very
abbreviations.
proud.
Sports reporter.
The thing was, though, no one could work out why he was disqualified, not even the poolside commentator. Kelly, who is missing both arms below the elbow and both legs, was swimming in the medley, and you're required to swim backstroke, then breaststroke, and then a freestyle lap, right? That's the last one. Did you know that in your freestyle lap, you can actually swim freestyle or butterfly? You know how the word is freestyle?
Oh.
And people choose freestyle because it's the fastest.
Uh-huh.
But for Kelly, he was like, I'm going to swim butterfly. He's been to 4 Olympic Games. Like, the man knows the rules.
He does.
Anyway, they disqualified him. And then following protests from Swimming Australia, he was reinstated and then went on to win a silver medal. In a post-swim interview, Kelly said, I've gone through a lot worse, and it's just been great to represent Australia in a Paralympic final. I can never get used to it. It's always a special thing to do.
Perspective.
Perspective. And my favourite thing, I mean, other than watching these phenomenal athletes, are some of the stories that come out of the Paralympics, because Ahmed Kelly spent the first 7 years of his life in an orphanage in Baghdad. And along with his brother, he was adopted by an Australian humanitarian worker named Moira Kelly. Both he and his brother were born with severely disabled limbs, and just like many other babies in Iraq, they had been impacted by chemical warfare. And this is Kelly's 4th Paralympic Games. He's been there since
What
London.
a legend. I mean, if you're not watching the Paralympics, you're missing out. I was cheering for Dana Creed. She's 22. She's from Victoria. It's her first Paralympics, and she won a bronze medal in the women's javelin F3-4, which was Australia's 10th medal on day 4. We are crushing it at the Paralympics.
We are in 6th place. So again, what Australians like is when we're doing very well at things.
Yeah.
And we are doing very well.
Can I ask a potentially sensitive question? All the categories, so you just said javelin, F3-4. I get confused about those, right? Sometimes you're watching and you're like, I don't think I understand what I'm watching.
Yep.
Is there like a place where you can just get across all that stuff?
Yes, it's called Google. I'll send the link after the
fair.
I'll send you a link after the show.
It's true, though, because sometimes you watch a swimming race. I mean, you go, these people have varying different disabilities, right?
Yeah.
And what's fascinating is watching how they differently approach the race, and you think you know who looks like they're going to win, and then they don't.
Yeah.
But you're right. There are different categories, and there's a very specific system that goes, this is this category. So we will link in the show notes so that you can understand, Holly.
On the weekend, the Venice Film Festival was like an explosion in a Gen X icon factory. Nicole Kidman was there, George Clooney was there, Brad Pitt was there, and they all looked exactly the same as they always have, just like I do. And then there was the great Angelina Jolie comeback. Our Ange, as I will forever call her, was there because she's got her first starring role in a big deal Oscar-worthy movie in decades, right? She's in a biopic of Maria Callas, who's like the iconic opera singer from the 50s, 60s. The movie got an 8-minute standing ovation. It's directed by the guy who did Spencer and did Jackie. You know, this is
It's a trilogy. This is the last in his trilogy.
Of like iconic women. If you've seen either of those movies, they're arty, they're dark. That's the vibe of this one too.
And she sings in it.
She
sings opera.
She did all the training.
Can she sing? Do we know? Have we ever heard her sing?
She said something really interesting in the interview. She said she always loved singing and she used to sing when she was younger, and she had a relationship with someone who was very cruel to her about her singing, so she stopped. She didn't say who that was.
Speaking of which, she did manage while she was there and getting her 8-minute standing ovation for the movie, etc., to avoid Brad Pitt, despite Venice being a very small place, thanks to a very carefully curated PR schedule. Now, look, I could talk about the joy of seeing Jolie back at work for a week. I just love her. And considering all the shit that's been thrown at her since her very acrimonious and actually legally still ongoing split from Pitt.
Thanks to him.
Thanks to him. He keeps dragging it out.
Yep.
We're not going to go into all the details, of course, but top line, she alleges that he physically abused her and some of their 6 children before their split 8 years ago now. 8 years. He's always denied it, and he claims that she's long been running a smear campaign against him. She, of course, has been raising all those kids pretty much on her own since that divorce, but now the youngest of them is 16, and so she is back at work, which is great to see. But it's actually a comment from Jolie about friendship that started the conversation we're having today, because Mia and I have an ongoing, long-standing disagreement about Jolie, and this speaks to it. As part of the comeback and doubtless an Oscar campaign, she's doing lots of interviews, and this first one is in The Hollywood Reporter, and she was asked who she trusts, who she calls at 3 a.m, and Jolie said, I don't really have those kind of relationships. Maybe it's losing your parent young. Maybe it's working. Maybe it's being somebody who's been betrayed a lot. I don't have a lot of those warm, close relationships as much that I lean on. My mother was very close to me. I lost her. I've had a few friends over the years not be there for my family in their hour of need. I have only a couple of people that I trust. I want to know, Jessie, why this is a bold thing for a woman or maybe even a person to admit that they don't really have friends.
It is almost the ultimate status symbol to have a gaggle of girlfriends. We've talked about that before, to kind of be surrounded by, you know, even the Taylor Swift example, or the contrast it is always made with Angelina Jolie, which is Jennifer Aniston. And she famously is very close to Courtney Cox. She's very close to Reese Witherspoon. They're always photographed out.
She's always going on holiday with her pals.
Yes. Whereas for Angelina Jolie, that's never been part of her identity. And it's probably worth acknowledging too that she's been seen constructed by the tabloids, but also due to a few plot points in her life, seen as a bit of not a girl's girl. And that's because, of course, Brad Pitt was married to Aniston when he met Jolie, but also Billy Bob Thornton, who was with Laura Dern when he met Angelina Jolie. There's a famous quote by Laura Dern: I left our home to work on a movie, and while I was away, my boyfriend got married and I've never heard from him again. In saying that, as soon as I saw this quote, I went, duh, she's a single mum to 6 kids. Like, when do you fit in friendship when you're that busy? She's also an introvert. Like, you hear the way that she talks about her life and her relationships. And sometimes I think that family life, having all those kids, can be really good for introverts. And that's what she said. She's got some beautiful quotes about, like,
because your life is all at home and you don't have to leave the house for
it. She says, like, I never expect to be the one that everybody understands or likes, and that's okay because I know who I am and the kids know who I am. That was in 2017. And she said, we're really such a unit. They're the best friends I've ever had. Nobody in my life has ever stood by me more.
She gave birth to her friends.
Well, I like that. Yeah, some of them. I feel a little bit that way too, although I do have a lot of female friends. But I've always found it notable, and I'm not part of the crew who is, I'm team Jennifer. I think marriages end. I think Brad Pitt's the asshole here. You know, it's worth noting that he's also premiering a movie in Venice, and he chose this moment to hard launch his relationship at age 60 with 34-year-old woman called Inez, who he's been dating for a while, but he knew that would pull lots and lots of focus to him away from her and would be also a diversion.
It's telling that they're not co-parenting. It's telling that she's done, like that the kids have sided with her.
Correct. Because the kids were not all little when they split.
He famously, too, does have friends, right? The buddy thing with Clooney has been going on for decades and he's in this movie. And so it looks like he's got them in his camp.
Yeah.
And they're very powerful and likable.
Yes.
And Angelina is always the loner. Are we scared of women who are loners?
Whenever a woman says, I'm just not a girl's girl, that immediately makes my hackles go up because it's a bit that sort of I'm just the cool girl, like I think the term is a pick-me girl who would prefer to hang with the guys. I just feel suspicious of that, perhaps because it's something I don't understand. I absolutely adore women and I can't imagine not having close female friends. But just the fact that she's never photographed, it's not just that she's never photographed, because I understand how paparazzi photos and photos at red carpets are not everything. They're just a tiny part of a life. But she never references other women. And I've always found that interesting and sort of notable.
I think she's very much a lone wolf. She says that she lost her mother and she's been betrayed by her father. I think she would probably have, just from like pop psychology 101, probably some trust issues.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she talks about that in this interview, and a couple of other nuggets that I loved were she did the interview for The Hollywood Reporter in her home, which I always find extraordinary when celebrities let journalists into their home. I can't understand why they would do it because it is so intimate. She's direct though. The reporter says, can I ask about the status of your divorce? And she says no. And then she asks her, well, you've been in LA for a while now, since like 2016. You used to travel a lot more. And she says, I have to stay here because of custody until my children are 18, but the youngest two nearly are. And then I think I'll go and live in Cambodia for a long time. And that's interesting too, something we didn't know, that she has to stay there. Even though the kids don't see him, that he's prevented her from taking them out of the country. So I think she's a complex character.
I think one of the reasons why people are still fascinated by her, because it was interesting to me watching the Gen X celebs at that festival, because they are still around, right? You know, Kidman's in lots of movies at the moment. She's on lots of covers. She's in lots of shoots. Clooney and Pitt are trying to make their buddy stuff still happen after 20-odd years. And of course they are. They're talented. They're at the top of their game. And there's obviously a younger gen coming in hard, your Chalamets and, you know, and those guys and Zendaya and everything. It's like, what do you do with the old movie stars now that we don't just shuffle them off? One of the reasons I've always loved Angelina Jolie, and I think the reason why her image is still interesting, is because it is a different vision of womanhood, right? Right from the beginning of her being famous, she's never played the I'm just like you thing, which is what we like our celebrities to do. We like to believe they're just like us. But right from the beginning, with her vials of blood around her neck and her kissing her brother at the Oscars and the extraordinary weird projects, well, not weird, but very offbeat projects she takes on. She directs movies in other languages. She's always trying to shine spotlights on difficult conflicts that nobody really wants to look at. Like, she's never been, I'm just like you. She's like, I am nothing like you. You are nothing like me. And I think that whether or not you like that probably says something about whether or not you feel the need to connect to somebody to like what they do.
That's so interesting.
Because she's always been famous, right? Like her father was
from
famous.
a really young age, yeah.
I imagine that friendships are really difficult to cultivate in that environment. And maybe if more people were honest, then we would find that a lot of people that famous are incredibly isolated.
Well, and a lot of non-famous people are. I mean, we hear from women all the time, don't we, that like the idea of having this amazing group of girlfriends is very aspirational, but it's not necessarily a reality for everybody. And maybe it's important for those people to hear somebody, I'm not that I'm saying they're sitting around waiting for Angelina Jolie to validate their life, but for somebody to say, well, actually, no, that's not what I have.
I received a Substack this morning from Helen Peterson, and the subject line was, did your parents have friends?
Oh, good question.
And she's writing a book at the moment. She's doing a big project, and that's how she opens the questions that she has about friendship, pretty much.
Is her book about friendship?
Yeah, it's about friendship. And a lot of people are surprised by that because they're like, oh, that's not something I think about a lot. But she says that there's a few things she's pulled out of the data. The first is that if your parents didn't have friends growing up, that is a source of deep sadness.
So you mean if your parents didn't have friends when you were growing up?
Yes. So,
like your memories of growing up didn't include...
Yeah. So like
right.
You had a sense that your parents were lonely or isolated or their activities revolved around you. Not only does that make you sad to look back on, but as an adult, a lot of people carry that and feel almost a lot of pressure, especially with aging parents where they just go, I've got to look after them. The other data point was that when they looked at parents and friendship, more often than not, it was the mother who was a social architect and the dad was more introverted and kind of went along, but it was the mum doing it. And I thought this was really relevant. She said, divorce often functions as a pivot point. After the divorce, one parent often becomes more isolated. So this is very relevant to Angelina Jolie. And I think the most telling quote was the one you said about, I've had a few friends that were not there in our moment of need. And the divorced families I know.
George Clooney, for starters.
Hollywood chose him. Hollywood always chose him. They chose him when he split with Jennifer. They chose him when he split with Angelina. They choose him. Hollywood is a boys' club no matter how you cut it and
That's so true.
much you think things have changed.
But I reckon in real life, it's probably often the bloke who becomes isolated after divorce because the stereotype that the woman is the social organizer is often true.
Yep.
Not necessarily that she gets custody of the friends because that depends very much on the circumstances of the split. But some men have never learned the skills of how to build a social life and keep up with people and keep friendships going and turn up for things. And that's such an interesting question because my parents always had friends and they are very good at friendship. They've held all their friends and I often feel a bit guilty because, you know, there are people in my life who were once really good friends but I've kind of lost touch with. But when I went back for my dad's 80th, they've got friends there from uni, which is 60 years ago, and I'm deeply impressed. They're good friend role models.
And Helen Peterson says that the real shift is that now our weekends and our spare time revolves around
our children.
Our children's activities, whereas
if you've got children.
Memories that, you know, Gen X might have or I have is that weekends were spent at my parents' friend's house. I didn't know the kids.
Yes.
I was put in a room with a movie on.
Yep.
If there was a swimming pool, I was just, you'd won the
but
jackpot.
There were a lot of,
100%.
you became friends with your parents' friends' kids. And I mean, there was a term for it, family friends. And there's a whole group of people, both the adults and their kids who I grew up with, who I've got a real sort of connection to. I don't see them or speak to them or stay in contact with the kids necessarily anymore. But they were really strong parts of your life because I didn't spend weekends with my own friends. I spent them with the kids of my parents' friends. But that wouldn't happen anymore, really.
Now we've got what she refers to, and Helen Peterson wrote about this a while ago. It's called the friendship dip. And all the data says that 30s and 40s, your lives, it's not just parenting. Even if you don't have kids, your life gets really, really busy. And a lot of people exit their 40s with not a lot of friends. And then hopefully, as you get older, there's a lot of reconnecting. I see this with people who are like, you know, retiring or their kids have left the house or whatever. There's more time. And I think they realize as well the importance of friendship. But I thought with Jolie, she's really in the midst of that friendship dip.
Although now I'm worried about the 6 kids because if Helen Peterson is right and that they're looking at their mum going, why doesn't she have any friends?
Yeah.
Now they'll be
Feel the
worried.
burden.
They've read about this.
If you want to hear about Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie on the red carpet at the Venice Film Festival and everything that's happening there, listen to our entertainment podcast, The Spill. We have a link in our show notes.
Mamamia out loud!
Out louders, do you want the government to ask you about your sexuality? What about your gender identity or your genitals? These were all census questions which were considered by the Australian Bureau of Statistics for the 2026 census, but they were initially rejected for inclusion by the Prime Minister to avoid a divisive culture war, which is what he said. Unfortunately, this sparked a divisive culture war. Peter Dutton agreed that the questions shouldn't be included because they were too woke, and many members of the queer community were upset because they said the fact the census in 2021, which was the last time we had one, didn't specifically ask about their sexuality or gender identity or trans or intersex identity and the makeup of their family, that made them feel invisible. Then 6 Labor MPs broke ranks against the Prime Minister and they told Albo to reverse this decision, and on Friday he did. So now one more question will be added on sexual preference, but there won't be a question on trans and intersex people. This is what he said.
We are consistent about having a common sense approach to these issues. We want to make sure that everyone is valued, regardless of their gender, their race, their faith, their sexual orientation.
Now, I wanted to sort of know what to think about this. I'm not a member of this community, so it sort of doesn't really matter what I think. But I wanted to understand the two sides. And there was a fantastic column over the weekend by Jacqueline Maley, who's one of my favourite columnists. And she sort of outlined that the arguments against it, and let's go into this assuming that everybody came from a well-meaning place, she said the reasons that you might not want to have that question there is that even though the census data is anonymised, some Australians would object to the government inquiring into a subject that they considered private. The way that sort of income, I think, is pretty private. Marital status is a law. The tax department has a record of your income, but maybe you don't want the government asking who you sleep with.
I'm just trying to remember what they do ask at the moment, right? So they do it every 5 years, don't they? And they ask you if you're single, married, de facto.
Yeah, they ask about religion. I think what they're thinking, though, is that if you get the census in your household, this was one of the arguments, whether or not it's a strong argument is to be decided, but do you then look at each of your children, depending on, don't know the politics of your family, but and say, do you identify as gay or straight or bisexual?
Might be your flatmate.
Yes.
It might be your partner who is bisexual, but you've never talked about it. I mean, you don't know.
Yeah.
And another reason against it is that coming out on the census form could be particularly risky for some people who are in conservative religious communities or living in a non-queer friendly household. And when it comes to trans and intersex people, there are some who don't want to disclose their anatomy on a Australian Bureau of Statistics form. The other thing against it is that every time there's a census, everybody applies to have a question included about their particular area of interest or their particular community. And every question that's in there is an enormous cost. That's where the government has to decide, based on the recommendations by the Australian Bureau of Statistics, yes to this question, no to that question. If we have this question, we can't also afford to have that question. It's not just an endless, you can ask whatever you want. And that's something I didn't realise. Now, the arguments for including it, I want to read what Jack Maley said. She said the fact that Albo had said he doesn't want to cause division, she said to lay the blame for those conflicts, which she agrees are real. I mean, we just had to see what happened with the Olympics and the boxer, and these things can cause hostility and division, which can be very harmful. She says to imply that even talking about those issues is creating social division is regressive, and it's also not fair to put that responsibility on that community. And she says one person's woke agenda is another person's idea of inclusion, and it's a debate that needs to be had respectfully. And she basically says it's a government's job to lead us through this division, not to say, oh, there's division, we're not going to talk about it because it'll make things worse. It's like, well, that's your job, is to lead the way, surely.
I found the government's response to why the question wasn't included to be incredibly unsatisfying. So, and I thought that this was a fairly good point, that it had sort of been promised that there would be a question in there. So there was a commitment from the government to include LGBTIQ plus Australians in the consultation and planning process for the 2026 census, and to ensure that the census gathers relevant data on these Australians. So when they didn't do it, and then the community said, hey, why didn't you do it? I was all ears because I went, I'm sure there's a rational, but it was basically, we don't want to be divisive.
Yeah, we don't want there to be a row.
Yeah, which I just thought, well, that's not a very good answer.
People can get very distressed if they feel they're being made to be invisible. So much progress has been made with same-sex marriage and a much greater social understanding of these issues. And I think that so many people have people who are LGBTQI plus in their family, but you can't just ask one blanket question. And I think as the sort of the rainbow family letters gets longer, it does become complex because there isn't necessarily a single question that will be helpful to data analysts that mixes ideas around sexuality and gender.
So one argument I read that I thought was interesting was if there is a question about gender identity, say, which for members of the community, I mean, some say it's important, others say they don't want to be asked. We've got to acknowledge that there's diversity within the community. There are a large portion of Australians that will not actually understand the question. And they said that if there was something about sex and gender, then what they were having to do on the form was explain how to distinguish it. Because I'm thinking about my grandfather going, he wouldn't necessarily understand what that means.
And even in the explanations, that can be quite controversial.
Yes. And so this was...
But does he need to? This is my question about this, is that surely a lot of what this all comes down to is how important the census is. If the census is really the one way that we're all counted and our needs are considered and it's the way that we decide how we divvy up government money and how many people in the population this is relevant to and that's not relevant to, if it is that important, then of course it needs to find these things out. And if they're not relevant to you, you just tick your box M and you move on.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like the other thing is it's not that important, which is, there are other ways of working out how many people in the population don't identify as one of two binary genders. And then that's another argument. But if we're saying that the census is the way to do it, surely it's got to do it.
So the argument I read about that is, because I kept thinking, move on to the next question if it doesn't apply to you. Not the way the census works. So they said, what we don't want is dodgy data. We don't want data that doesn't reflect Australians, because then we've spent an enormous amount of money framing a question, asking people that question, and then getting the research analysed where the data actually isn't reflective of Australians because you felt you couldn't answer honestly or you didn't understand the question.
There would be lots of things in the census that people aren't answering honestly already.
Yes, I reckon,
and
I agree.
And of course there would. And they're asking me what religion I am, right? And if I don't want to answer that, I don't have to answer that. And if they're asking me exactly what I earn, people will lie about that.
So the first thing, when I kept seeing this and I kept hearing visibility, and I thought, I don't think the census is about visibility. It's not about count every group or whatever. But then I actually listened to some advocates and I had my mind completely changed. What they said is that, for example, why do they ask about religion? Everyone says that. They ask about religion because they need to know about religious adherence in each sort of state and suburb so that they know in this suburb there is this percentage of Muslims and they require a mosque. Right? It's a lot to do with policy and it's a lot to do with funding.
And understanding the changing makeup of our society, which means that sexuality and gender and understanding how that's changing is really important.
Of course
These
is.
are the
It's really
conversations that
important.
people are having around dinner tables and at barbecues because it's embedded in all of our lives.
But it's actually a really important economic policy. And that's because if we do the census and discover that there is a large LGBTQI plus community in a region of the Northern Territory and we have absolutely no services for them, no mental health services, when we know that the mental health outcomes for people in that community are a lot worse, then they can't be serviced.
Exactly.
So I heard an advocate saying we're working blindfolded at the moment. We've got public policy and we've got these budgets that we're throwing here and here when we don't know if that's...
Because we don't have any
Exactly.
data.
So to your point about the government's answer of why they weren't going to ask being unsatisfying, that's why, right? Because if there are other ways of measuring those things, then tell us that. Do you know what I mean? If there's other ways that are credible and deeply informed about working out what percentage of the population we need to invest in, then tell us what they are. But don't just say it's too hard to have the conversation, because I don't think that's what governments get to do.
I think it actually speaks to a bigger question that is generational to an extent, which goes beyond the census, which is whether you think sexuality is private or not. And there are some people who are like, don't ask me about my sexuality. The reality...
There are some people who hate filling out the census at all for this reason.
Exactly.
You're very secretive, Hol. I feel like you would
I
be
am,
like,
it's true.
don't ask me where
Don't
I'm
ask me
sleeping
that.
tonight.
Move on. Want unlimited Out Loud access? We drop episodes every Tuesday and Thursday exclusively for Mamamia subscribers. Follow the link in the show notes to get us in your ears 5 days a week. And a huge thank you to all our current subscribers.
Is the Me Too moment over? Are we experiencing post-Me Too creep? And what do those questions have to do with a new, very sexy calendar? Guardian columnist Barbara Ellen writes, "Tasteful nudity is back in business. It's as if the last 7 years had never happened." If you've never heard of the Plli Calendar, neither until today, but basically it's an annual calendar. I'd never heard of it. As calendars tend to be. They tend to be annual. Published by the tyre manufacturing company Pirelli for the last 60 years. But for the last 7 of those, the Plli Calendar has not been your classic nudie, sexy male gaze calendar. Subjects have been more clothed. They've embraced more diversity in age. In 2018, they only featured women of colour. But this year, photographer Ethan James Green said, "Me Too really forced everyone to take a pause, which is really good. My initial thoughts when I was approached to shoot the calendar were, if I'm going to do Pirelli, I want to do Pirelli. I wanted to go back to the sexy classic." Apparently there's been a resurgence in sexy films and TV shows. Victoria's Secret brought back their signature wings, and some male actors are pushing back on on-set intimacy coordinators. Mia, are we losing the gains of the Me Too movement?
I don't know if this is necessarily the best example of that. I think that these things go in cycles and pendulums swing. And I think that there was a lot of understandable correction and very necessary correction, because let's be clear about what Me Too was. It wasn't about, eye rolly, you can't have push-up bras or sexy calendars anymore. It was actually supposed to be a live mandate telling men to stop sexually abusing, harassing and coercing women in the workplace. Mm-hmm. Whether it was a film and TV set or in an office or in a hotel room with a jacuzzi or wherever it was, at the photocopier, in a restaurant. And I think that that's really important. But the problem with the Plli Calendar, and it's kind of symbolic in the same way that the market just corrected with Victoria's Secret, that kind of girls prancing down a runway. And we learned later that there was a lot of terrible things that went on behind the scenes. I was talking to a person on Friday night, a woman who was a model at this time in the early 2000s, about what Victoria's Secret castings were like. She said it was shocking what went on, like the way that the models were demeaned, the sleaziness, the creepiness of it all. And I think it's great that hopefully that doesn't happen anymore. In terms of what imagery is put out there, what's interesting is that social media has allowed women to sexualize themselves. And Holly and I have arguments about this all the time. Many people will say it's a good thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I feel frustrated when it feels sometimes like women have taken on the job of maintaining oppressive beauty standards to get likes, get deals, get better roles, get more attention in the attention economy.
Haven't women always done that? Is that new?
Yes. And I think it's new that, well, now women can do it on their own social platforms, which is clearly an improvement on
they can own it.
On men just doing it. But gosh, it would be nice if women could do some other things. Like J-Lo over the weekend released her first post-divorce
Playbook
post.
Yep.
And it was a playbook. There was an inspo quote, and then there was a shot of her looking directly at camera, very tricky to set up, with a mirror behind her. In the background, you can see her ass reflected. And
I
it's
have
like
to defend J-Lo for 1 second, because you just said it would be nice if they did
just
some other
super thirsty.
things. There were like 12 pictures in that carousel, and only one of them showed her bottom. So she was doing 11 other things, but Mia only chose to see one.
It was the ultimate relaunch.
Well, but that's mandatory, right? And it's like it's the other ones are there to justify the one of her ass. And I don't blame J-Lo, because that's still how we value women, by what their asses and their faces look like.
Mia, I want you to save that, bookmark it.
So
that
anyway,
when you
coming
come
back
out of
to
a
that,
relationship.
in the 2025 Plli Calendar, there are men. They've had people fully clothed before. And the photographer himself, that quote was a little bit unfair in that column. I went back and looked what he originally said, because she made it seem like it's like, oh, we had a little pause for Me Too and now we're back to being exploitative of women. It's not what he said. He said, I think, Me Too really forced everyone to pause, which is really good. And I think a lot of what sexy has become is like what we started seeing on people's social media, usually through selfies. So people have full control of what they're putting out there in showing how skin is captured and not doing anything that they're not comfortable with. And then he says his work is about being collaborative with the subject. And of course, women want to get their gear off because that's how you get power and status in this economy. The problem with the Plli Calendar is that it was given to mechanics. And it was to be in workplaces.
Actually,
and that was the problem.
The thing is about the Plli Calendar is it's always been really arty. There is generally, for want of a less vulgar term, there's a wank calendar for everybody, right? So the kind that you would see in a general mechanics shop, in a suburb, is not the Plli Calendar. It's always been arty, black and white, stunning. Even when it was nudie, it was always that. They've made it very specifically to raise their status. So it's nude women, but posh. Just like when I was young.
So we're talking about tires, so it works.
Could go to a man's house and he might have a loaded magazine poster on his wall and he could pretend it was ironic, but really it was still just a wank picture, right?
Yeah.
So these were the posh, posy wank pictures. They weren't really on mechanics walls because they've never sold them. They were always only given out to very few people, but they've always been this
marketing.
Intensely pretentious soft porn as opposed to just your bog standard soft porn. Mia's already made this point, which is the obvious one, that Me Too wasn't about put your clothes back on, ladies. Me Too was about if women are going to do whatever they want to do with their bodies, then they shouldn't be harassed while they're doing it. And wouldn't it be nice if they had some choice in the matter? And so it's not the nudity or otherwise itself that's the problem. It's the atmosphere in which it's created, right?
Yes. And Mia, I know what you're saying about that quote being taken out of context, but my question is why he brought up Me Too. Me Too has nothing to do with anything. It feels irrelevant to...
I think he was asked. It's become controversial, the idea of photographing women with their clothes off. It's why Playboy has closed. It's why...
It's become controversial because when they looked back, they realised that the conditions in which the women were being treated, as you said, were not right. And so we started looking at it through a different lens. But it's also worth looking at the timeline because he brought up Me Too. I looked at when this shift happened, and it actually happened in 2016, which is a year before Me Too. It wasn't Me Too that changed the Plli Calendar. It was a cultural shift that was already happening because in 2016, Annie Leibovitz celebrated women for their accomplishments. I remember this. It was the iconic Amy Schumer. She was there with a coffee cup and it was a bit funny, a bit ironic. It wasn't male gazy.
And there was Serena Williams where it really showed all her muscles, really, really strong photography. And a lot of people were like, well, what's the point of my arty, wanky calendar if the women are all showing me their accomplishments instead of their natural assets?
In 2017, an unretouched Dame Helen Mirren was Miss December.
Honestly.
And she was wrapped in a blanket. And then an unretouched Uma Thurman was Miss August and she was in a polo neck. And then in 2018, the calendar featured an all-black group of models, activists and actors. And so this idea of, we can get our boobs out again, it does feel a little, not even so much regressive, but just like it's almost twee, this idea that this calendar could be in any way shocking when you just flick through your phone and that's what everyone looks like.
Yeah, but I think that the conditions are very different, right? Like if I see, even I'm thinking about Emrata and what she said about the conditions of some of the photo shoots where she had her clothes off and how men owned her image. That makes me look at the photos differently. If Emrata shares a selfie, I don't feel that because no one else is profiting off that body.
She owns the means of production, basically, to your communist heart.
Exactly.
It's like if women are owning it, controlling it, profiting from it, it's completely different than if it's just the guys at Pirelli.
Before we wrap up the show today, Jessie, we've got a bit of a surprise for you.
Oh.
And we've got a bit of a guest to come in and follow up on a segment that we did last week. Where is our guest?
Oh, no.
You see, last week on the show, you mentioned the idea of the fair play cards and how you were feeling really resentful of how much mental load you'd taken on since Luna was born.
Yep.
And you ordered these cards which basically listed all the 100 or so
Household
chores
tasks. Yep.
in the household, and you were really happy that you were going to make the invisible visible, and it was not fair. You were tired of doing all the meals.
Yeah.
It had swung right out of balance since Luna was born.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to know, when you guys sat down with the cards, how'd it go? And since I feel like you might be an unreliable witness.
Do you guys like the look on my face? What's this face?
Well, I keep saying to
my
you,
smug
Luca
face.
Levine, there is no winners. This wasn't about winning and losing. It was about something else. All right, so basically there are 100 cards and then you choose the ones that are relevant to you and your family. And so I had gone through and chosen them. And we sat there and I was like, this isn't about winning or losing, but it's going to be embarrassing when you lose. And so I got
We'll pull up there just briefly. There was a period where we were on Friday afternoon, we're taking the dog to the park.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like a let's do the cards. I think that we maybe had like an hour or 2 hour long conversation where you were talking
it was
about
20 minutes. But yeah.
how
It just felt like 2
you
hours.
felt like you were carrying a lot of invisible load.
Invisible.
Invisible
We didn't have a
load.
good night's sleep, did we? Invisible load. Yes, that was happening, Luca, and that's part of communicating in a marriage.
What it seemed like you were sort of doing is it seems like you were steering into the cards as like I know where this is going personally.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like you were starting to take the run up on like your victory lap.
Yeah. What happened is that the cards were deeply flawed. The cards didn't fully represent my contribution to the household.
They were literally stacked against.
They were. And I have some feedback about the cards.
So what happens? There's 100 and you just choose and put in front of you the ones that of all the tasks that you do.
Yes, exactly. So, for example, I think the first card that we pulled was like IT stuff around the house. Okay, fair. I'll give that to Luca.
Yeah.
The second card was accounting. Okay, fair. I'll give that to Luca. The third card was repairs around the house. And I was like, this feels misogynistic, if you're asking me. The fourth card was garbage. And I was like, all right, where are all my tasks? And then there was nighttime wake-ups. Boom, me. Then there
You got a few good wins on the trot.
Yeah.
You picked up a little bit of momentum.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I did. Things such as enrichment for our child.
Yeah, you started clutching at straws after a little while.
Yeah, I did.
Is that a card? What's that?
Enrichment, just
Oh,
like
learning.
learning. I teach her everything. And then I did start going through the discarded cards that I said didn't really matter to our family and claiming some of those.
Yeah. I think beforehand you seemed to imply that you thought that there was a lot of invisible work
Yeah.
that you did around the house
Yeah.
mental load that I didn't know about.
Yeah.
And that's why we should do the cards. And my feedback was I know everything you do and you do an enormous amount around the house.
Yeah.
And you definitely 100% take the lion's share of the mental load when it comes to Luna.
Yeah.
And my feedback to you before we did the cards was maybe you don't have any visibility of what I do. I have visibility over what you do. So I don't think we need to do the cards. I'm comfortable. But if you need to do them as an exercise to see what I do, that's fine, whatever.
I would like to leave this conversation on one card, Mia. I haven't told you this story.
But so when the cards were out, how many cards
It's
did
not
Luca
about
have in
counting,
I
Mia.
want to know.
The vast majority by a long way.
You had.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question because you know I'm on your side, Jessie.
Thank you.
Not all jobs are equal.
Yes.
Like you can take a bin out. It's not the same as planning what the child's going to
true.
eat all week.
I completely agree. Wouldn't you say, Luca?
I think that it was pretty clear at the end who won. You're not meant to win, but who won.
There were a lot of tasks that weren't included. I will be writing to her. But how about this?
I do sense
There was
that
one
this
that
story is going
said
to backfire on me.
that said community service. And I looked at it and I said to Luca, actually, as a family, I think we could do more community service. And Luca said, I quote, I do community service. I referee. That is a paid job that Luca does on Saturdays. And he thought that was community service. And I said, that's just a job you do
Well, if you volunteered,
for money.
if you did it for no money,
The money is very small.
No, that's not what community service means.
why do you
Luca.
do
The
it?
bit about refereeing that I care about really
The control and having the
is
whistle.
giving back to the community.
It's not about
Yeah.
giving back to the community.
Do you know,
It's a job.
Jessie, I was worried when you said on Friday about getting the cards because I was like, this is a rookie error because my home setup is similar to yours in which
It's like challenging a fucking grandmaster chess player to a
Yeah.
game of chess.
I would not want to see all the things that my partner does.
I am the mental load.
I would have so few
you're
cards.
not.
So
I
do you
am.
feel less resentful afterwards, Jessie?
Making the bed wasn't a card.
Making the bed is not a mental load.
Yes, it
If
is.
you want to get up earlier and I get up last, I will make the
Oh,
bed. Making
I
the bed
hope
is just
you
how we start
included-
our day as human beings.
I hope you included that you have to organise all the childcare.
I did. That was one of them.
That's
that
a big
was my
job.
card.
That's harder than taking a bin out.
That
Some would
was one
say,
of her
what,
few
the
cards,
biggest?
Hol.
What happens when the nanny's sick / mum can't come over / whatever?
Exactly. I don't think this has fared well for our relationship, and I'm considering a divorce.
I'm worried.
Anyway, 1-0 Luca. Woo! Up top.
You know, a friend of mine, if she was listening to this, which she will be, she would be saying, but actually this doesn't apply to him, but it would apply to a lot of men. How well does he do those jobs? That's what she would say.
That's so true.
But unfortunately, Luca is quite thorough and organised. But a lot of men would be like, see, I did cook dinner, but cooking dinner was just like some Rivita with some avocado on it.
Yeah, that's like the one meal I know how to cook.
But I understand why you feel so kind of resentful because before you had no mental load pretty much.
Yeah.
And now it's all been downside for you in terms of extra work.
Apart from the beautiful child.
No, but I mean in terms of work, right? It's only been a massive increase for you.
Yes.
But for him, he hasn't gained any, but he's always had a ton.
You know what I
right?
think we should do on top of the cards is get out a timer. And every time you're doing something to contribute to the family, I think you'd get your timer.
We should put it on the census.
I feel like feelings should somehow be
That's
measured.
so true.
It's hard, but it's like I bring the good vibes.
I do too.
I bring the joy.
Yeah.
And I bring the lols. I bring the cheer.
Parenting is harder
that on a
than
car?
remembering to renew the car insurance. I'm sorry, but these jobs are not the same.
Exactly. There was one that was airline points. And I was like, I don't give a shit about airline points.
Exactly.
Throw that card out.
I've got you, Jessie. Out Loud is a massive thank you to you for being with us through our Monday show. Hopefully that little glimpse into Jessie and Luca's house brightened up your week. Please jump in the group and help us find a way to make Jessie win. A massive thank you too to our fabulous team who help us put this show together. We are going to be back in your ears tomorrow. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Shout out to any Mamamia subscribers listening. If you love the show and want to support us as well, subscribing to Mamamia is the very best way to do so. There is a link in the episode description.